Well, from the time I was a little kid, I think the greatest gift that God ever gave me was the gift of sleep. And it may be because I grew up sharing a bedroom with 5 brothers, and when they're playing with the lights on, you're tired, you just got to learn to sleep through it. And so I always could just fall asleep anywhere, just like that. I could lay on these black chairs when y'all are hanging out and go to sleep. I legitimately could do that. And I never knew where I got that until I went on a road trip with my grandpa when I was in 8th grade. We took a road trip together across 10 different states, and I kid you not, it was me and my brother Rousseau. We were road tripping with my grandpa, and every time we stopped, anywhere, the McDonald's parking lot or rest area, he could fall asleep legitimately anywhere. I kid you not. We pulled over in a rest area, and we're gonna run in and go to the bathroom and come right out. We run in, and a minute later, we come out of the bathroom. He's laying on the sidewalk like this, out cold, dude. I kid you not. I'm like, bro, you good? I'm like, dude, he was out on the sidewalk. And I'm like, wow, dude, that's where I got it, was from my grandpa. And so I thought I was a good sleeper. And I'm like, dude, I ain't got nothing on my gramps. And then I read this story. I thought my gramps was a good sleeper. And I was like, dude, he's got nothing on Jesus. Because in the story today, Jesus, we find out, is the ultimate power napper, napping in the midst of the gnarliest storm that probably ever was to hit the Sea of Galilee. So he's got my gramps beat, which is kind of cool. So in our story today, we're going to learn about Jesus sleeping on a boat in the midst of a crazy, crazy storm. Now, if you grew up in the church or you grew up in Sunday school, this is probably one of the most famous stories about Jesus in all of the scriptures. And if you're familiar with the story, you could probably get up here and tell us what the story's about or what the story means for your life. And if you grew up in church and if you've heard this taught, it probably goes something like this. Jesus calmed the storms of the sea, and so Jesus wants to calm the storm in your life, right? I grew up in church, and I've probably heard that message at least 5 or 10 times. And if that's really what it's about, we should just say that, and I can save you the next 30 minutes and be like, that's what it is. Jesus calmed a storm, and he's gonna do that for you. And then we can all pray and go home, right? Well, that'd be really nice, but as I've studied this passage and continue to look at this passage, I actually don't believe that that's what this passage is about. I don't believe that Jesus calming the storm, that the big picture and big idea is Jesus is gonna calm all the storms in our life. And although Jesus does and can, and at times will calm the storms of our life, again, that's not the point of this story. And so we have to look a little bit more at the details, especially if you've grown up in the church and already know this story, okay, I got it, Jesus is gonna do that. We gotta look at it with fresh eyes and say, God, what's actually going on here, and dive a little bit deeper. So if you would look down with me, starting in verse 35, let's relearn the story of Jesus' ultimate power nap and then calming the storm. It says in verse 35, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. So we're here coming towards the end of chapter 4, and if you've been tracking with us through the Gospel of Mark, we remember that at the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus went out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee because the crowds that were pressing Jesus, that were wanting to hear from Jesus, that were wanting to be healed by Jesus and prayed for by Jesus, the crowds were so big that Jesus, in order to actually talk to the people, had to get on a boat and go out to the lake. So all of chapter 4, which up to this point in time has been parables, remember, Jesus is on a boat in the lake talking to a massive crowd at the shore, telling them parables about the kingdom of God. And now the end of the preaching day has come where Jesus has taught them all of these lessons. And at the end of the day, Jesus now invites his disciples into the boat with him. He says to go over to the other side of the sea, which is the Sea of Galilee. Now, what's interesting and important to know is that when Jesus says we are about to go to the other side, disciples, do you want to come with me? Do you want to hop and get in this boat? The other side of the lake was Gentile territory. So where Jesus' disciples, who are primarily Jewish, are, it was the Jewish territory. It was safe. It was comfortable for them. To go to the other side of the lake was to go over to where the Gentiles were, those to whom the promises and the covenants had not been made. And so in the Jewish mindset, that was probably kind of freaky. They would associate that sort of with like going over to like the place of evil where darkness is and the people who aren't actually wanting to follow Jesus. But Jesus says, that's where we're going. So if you want to come with me, step into the boat. We're going to go over to the Gentiles. Not only that, but also he says we're going to have to go across the sea to be able to get there, the Sea of Galilee. And in the ancient Near East, the sea was actually symbolic for the place of evil and the place of chaos and the place where God and evil and God and chaos collided and went head to head. If you're familiar with the opening of the scriptures, you may kind of pick up on this language where in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, it says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So at the beginning of the scriptures, we see that there was darkness hovering over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. God takes the waters which were chaotic and he speaks light and he brings peace into the chaos. We see this all throughout the Psalms as well, that the Psalms often depict God as a ruler who is set against the chaos of the waters, the evils of the sea. For example, Psalm chapter 93, verses 3 and 4, it says this: "The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring." Then he says, "Mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty." So here we see the seas, the waters raging, the chaos, the evil, and God being mightier than them. Not only that, but the scriptures actually end in Revelation chapter 21, verse 1. It's my least favorite verse in the Bible because I love surfing. Revelation 21, verse 1 says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." Dang it. That's like, again, I wish that verse wasn't in the Bible, but it is. I gotta say it as it is. I gotta call a spade here, right? So this is the new heavens and the new earth. He says the sea is no more. Now, luckily for me, the point here of new heavens and new earth and no, the sea being no more isn't that there is necessarily no ocean. Again, the sea in the Jewish scriptures and the Hebrew mindset was, again, the place of evil, the place of chaos. And so when he says there's gonna be a new heavens and new earth and the sea is no more, he means there's gonna be no more evil. There's gonna be no more chaos. There's gonna be no disorder raging against God's rule, because God is gonna rule and God is gonna reign in the new heavens and the new earth. So for us, we read the disciples are going out on the Sea of Galilee, and now people go and vacation there, but they didn't do that back then. Back then, the sea was not the place where you go and take a nice vacation. Again, it was the place of chaos. It was known as the place where evil powers were at work. And so obedience to Jesus' command, when Jesus invites the disciples, "Hey, do you guys want to come with me? First off, we're going to go to the other side of the lake. That's where the Gentiles are." And the Jews didn't typically like the Gentiles. Jesus says, "That's where I'm going." Not only that, though, he says, we're going to have to go across the sea. And so for the disciples to obey this command, they had to leave the crowd. They had to leave the shore. They had to leave the place of safety and the place of comfort and join Jesus in the boat. But if Jesus is in the boat, although it may be a little bit chaotic and although you may encounter some evil, Jesus is with you in the boat. And so the disciples decide, you know what? It's worth it. It's worth it. Rather than staying here on the shore with the crowds where it's safe, comfortable, predictable, we're gonna go on this journey with Jesus and we're gonna see where Jesus leads us. So they get in the boat with him, it says in verse 36, just as he was, and there actually was other boats with them. Now check this out, verse 37. It says, "And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But he," Jesus, "was in the stern asleep on a cushion." And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now, keep in mind here, a couple of the disciples are fishermen, and they'd grown up on the Sea of Galilee, and they were familiar with the waters. And so what was essentially a normal, just routine journey for the disciples, it quickly evolved into a life-threatening situation. The disciples are sailing across the sea, trying to get over to the Gentile territory, and it says a great windstorm arose. Some of the translations of the scriptures translate great windstorm into a furious squall. I like that better. So a furious squall arose, and it says that the waves were coming over the boat and filling the boat. This is kind of like a surfer's dream. The boat is getting barreled. That's what you want when you're surfing. You want to get barreled. That's what's happening to the boat. These waves are so huge, it's coming in, but the disciples are freaked out. And in the midst of the disciples freaking out because of this furious squall, because of this great storm, we see that Jesus is actually, again, taking a power nap in the stern of the boat. And it's beautiful when you actually look at the contrast of what Jesus is doing and the disciples is doing. Jesus is going out onto the sea, the place of evil, going over to Gentile territory, the place where the Jews wouldn't want to be. And Jesus is just at rest. Jesus is just at peace. Jesus is trusting the Father, trusting that the Father is going to get them there safely, trusting that this is where God's calling us to go to proclaim the gospel. And in contrast to Jesus resting and being at peace with the Father in the midst of that, the disciples are filled with terror. The disciples are freaking out, and the disciples are thinking that they're gonna die. Now, here's the crazy thing. Jesus had asked them, "Hey, will you guys take me across to the other side of the lake?" Jesus asked them that. He's like, "We're going to the other side. Are you guys gonna come with me? Can you take me?" Remember, back then, boats didn't have motors. It's not just like bzz, cruise and you're there. Like, all they had was rows. So for the disciples to jump in the boat, they're committing to rowing this boat through a storm. This was no just like, oh, chill vibes, get on your yacht and cruise across. No, Jesus didn't have no yacht. He had a rowboat, okay? So the disciples agreed to take Jesus across the lake. Jesus is sleeping on the boat, and we see that in their obedience, when the disciples were obeying Jesus, "Jesus, we're gonna obey you. We're gonna go across the lake. We're gonna go across the sea. We're gonna go into the Gentile territory. If that's where you wanna go, we're gonna go." It was in their obedience that they were led right into the eye of the storm. Now, this is where it gets kind of tricky for us, and maybe tricky for church people, and tricky if you grew up in the church, because we see that the disciples are walking in perfect obedience to the will of Jesus. They're saying yes to what Jesus is calling them to, and Jesus takes them, as it seems, right into the eye of the storm. Most of us, if you grew up in the church, you're familiar with the story of Jonah. Jonah was rebelling against God. Jonah was running from God. Jonah was walking in disobedience to God, and so God sent a storm so that Jonah would have to get thrown overboard, and then God in his grace sent a giant fish, and it swallowed Jonah up, and it spit Jonah up right where he was supposed to be, on the seas of Nineveh. That's easy to preach. It's easy to say God sends the storm to Jonah because Jonah was in rebellion. Jonah was running from God. Jonah was disobeying, and so of course God had to do something to get him back on track. But in the disciples' case, there is no disobedience. In the disciples' case, they were perfectly obeying what Jesus had asked them to do. And so this gets interesting for us, because in our theology, we've been taught from this story, God is the God who wants to just get us through the storm. God wants to bring you through the trial, and he wants to just get you to the other side and wants everything to go so smoothly. But the question I think we need to ask is there room in your theology to say that maybe God is actually the one who brings you into the storm for a purpose that is greater than what you may be able to see or understand in that moment? And maybe the storm isn't I'm running from God and rebelling against God. Maybe it's I'm actually trying to the best of my ability to follow Jesus. I'm walking in obedience to Jesus, and yet here it comes. Here comes the storm. Here comes the brokenness. Here comes the suffering. Here comes the pain. Here comes all of that. Not because I'm disobeying, but because God has something for me in the pain, in the brokenness, in the storm. Isn't it the same God in Psalm 23? Isn't the same God who leads us beside the green pastures and still waters? Isn't that the same God who leads us into and then through the valley of the shadow of death? We like to talk about, we get to the green pastures, we get to the still waters, but it's God as well who's just as present and just as much leading us into and through the valley of the shadow of death. And so what we need to see and understand in this is that God is a God who, for his own purposes, which at times we cannot and will not ever fully understand, because God's ways are higher than our ways. The scripture says, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so are God's ways higher than ours. So we can't try to pigeonhole God and figure out exactly how he always works, because if you could understand exactly how God works all the time, you would be God. And so it's great that I read this and I go, God, I don't understand this. I don't know why you work like this. This doesn't make sense. That's good. That shows me that God's bigger than my tiny little brain. But God is a God who, for his own purposes that we may not understand, will in seasons lead us into various trials and storms and difficulties so that he can reveal his power and his greatness in the midst of our weakness. This is what the book of James says. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, James writes this actually. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Wow. James says, when you're in the storm, when you're in the trial of various kinds, he says, actually count it all joy, because it is producing something in you that is something that can't be produced without that trial, without that storm, without that testing of your faith. It's producing steadfastness. How can we have steadfastness without testing, without trials, without storms, without difficulties? And he says, let steadfastness have its full effect. It can't have its full effect if my idea of God is all God wants to do is hurry up and get me through this. All God wants for me is for my life to be safe and comfortable, enjoyable, and everything goes nice all the time. If that's my idea of God, how can steadfastness and fullness of faith and being complete and lacking nothing, how can that be produced in me if there's no room in my theology for saying, man, maybe God actually wants me in the midst of this storm right now, in the midst of this trial right now, because he's doing something deeper in me that couldn't be produced without it. See, our faith isn't so much that God is a God who wants to deliver us from storms. It's even greater than that. Our faith is rather in a God who is with us in the storm, who is present with us in the suffering, who meets us in our brokenness, so much so that he stepped down into it in the incarnation, which is what we're going to be talking about on Christmas Eve. That's the God we serve, not God, get me through this. He says, I have something better for you. I'm actually going to be there with you in it. Jesus was in the boat with the disciples in the storm. Isn't that incredible? So I think we need to shift our perspective and understanding of who God is, and understand that God is a God who, yes, there will be this time where you make it through the valley of the shadow of death, but that's not the focus. The focus is God. Wow, thank you that you're here with me, that you're present with me in the suffering, that you're present with me in the divorce, you're present with me in the cancer, you're present with me in the fill in the blank. Whatever your storm is, whatever the trial is, whatever it is you're facing, it's not, God, hurry and get me through this. It's, God, maybe this is a part of your bigger plan. For some reason, you've brought me into this because you're trying to produce steadfastness in me. You're trying to allow my faith to not be in the temporary, but actually in you, and trust that you're going to be present with me through this, whether it works out in the way that I want or not. That I have you, and that you're present, and that you're here. Isn't that amazing? That's genuine faith. It's that Jesus is with us in the trial, not God, just get me through this. He has something better. He's with us in it. And it's interesting to note as well that, again, those who were on the shore, because Jesus was just preaching to a giant crowd. Remember, Jesus invited the disciples to come into the boat with him. Those who were on the shore, those who played it safe, they were not affected by the storm. It was only the disciples who said, Jesus, we're willing to go into the place of chaos. We're willing to go to the Gentile territory. We're willing to go onto the sea, the place of chaos and evil. It was only the disciples who were walking in complete obedience, who had forsaken everything to follow Jesus. It was only the disciples who were affected by the storm. Isn't that interesting? The people on the shore who said, okay, I'm good here, Jesus. I'll stay on the shore. The disciples, yeah, you guys can go, but I'm chilling here. It was only the disciples, only those walking in complete, perfect obedience who went through this storm. But here's what I would say. It's better to be with Jesus in the storm than to not have the storm and be without Jesus. That's so much better. You look at the people on the shore, they're chilling, they're partying, they're having a great time, but where's Jesus? He's not with them. He's in the storm. He's in the brokenness. He's in the suffering. He's in the hardship. He's with the disciples who are walking in obedience. And this is so important for us to understand as followers of Jesus, to have this type of perspective that, again, to say yes to Jesus and to walk with Jesus and to follow Jesus, it doesn't mean now your life's gonna be great and everything's gonna be amazing. There can be a temptation as you're following Jesus to look at people who aren't following Jesus, the people on the shore, the people who said, no, I'm good, I don't want to come any further, and to say, wow, why is their life so amazing? Why does it seem like everything's going so good for the world and everything's so hard for me? Why disciples, am I in the boat and I'm following Jesus and I'm with him, but I'm in the storm and they're not? We can do that. And the psalmist actually wrestled with that exact same question. I love this psalm, Psalm chapter 73. If you want to flip over there real quick, this is so beautiful. The psalmist asked the same question that the disciples are probably asking. God, here we are walking in obedience to you. We stepped into the boat. We've given everything to follow you, and we're in the storm. And if I just chilled on the shore, there would be no storm. So what's the deal with that? Why are these guys who aren't following you and not pursuing, why is everything going good for them and not good for me? Psalm chapter 73 is the answer to that question. Starting in verse 3, check this out. Psalm 73, verse 3. The psalmist writes this, for I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Wow, the wicked are prospering. Those on the shore, those not, everything's going great for them. And I'm envious, I'm jealous. Why is everything going so good for them and not for me? That's what the psalmist is asking. He says, verse 4, for they have no pangs until death. Their bodies are fat and sleek. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not stricken like the rest of mankind. Therefore, pride is their necklace. Violence covers them as a garment. Their eyes swell out through fatness. Their hearts overflow with follies. They scoff and speak with malice. Loftily they threaten oppression. They set their mouths against the heavens, and their tongue struts through the earth. Therefore, his people turn back to them and find no fault in them. And they say, how can God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked. They're always at ease. They increase in riches. All in vain I have kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. The psalmist is saying, is it in vain that I've tried to keep my heart clean and pure and be innocent and follow Jesus? I look at the wicked and they're prospering and their riches are increasing and they're always at ease and they have everything they want. Is it in vain that I've been following the Lord? And then he says in verse 14, for all the day long I've been stricken and rebuked every morning. If I had said, I will speak thus, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I discerned their end. He said, when I thought about this, why are the people on the shore, the people not following you, why are they so prosperous? Why is everything working out? And then he says, I look at my life, and he says, I'm stricken all day long. I'm rebuked every morning. I'm like the disciples. I'm in the storm. Why is this? He says, to understand this, it was a wearisome task. It was a burden. He says, but it wasn't until I went into the sanctuary of God that I discerned their end. And here's how the psalm ends in verse 27 and 28. Here's his conclusion. He says, for behold, those who are far from you shall perish. You put an end to everyone who is unfaithful to you. He says, but for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the Lord my refuge that I may tell of all your works. He says, the way I understand this is in the end, They have nothing. In the end, they're brought to nothing. He says, but for me, it's good to be near to God. And what the psalmist found is that it was actually like the disciples in the storm, in the trial, in the times when he was stricken and afflicted, that he was so near to God. And he said, I have made God my refuge. I have made God the place I turn, the place I go, the one to whom I turn in the midst of my brokenness and in the midst of my suffering. And this is so encouraging because at times I've struggled with this. Man, God, I'm really trying to follow you. I'm really trying to pursue you. I'm like the disciples. I'm trying to walk in obedience. And why is everything going so good for the world and not so good for me? And God says, I have something more for you than what the world is pursuing. It's intimacy with me. Being in the storm with Jesus is greater than being without Jesus and not being in the storm. And so I want to just encourage you this morning and remind you that in the midst of your pain and suffering and brokenness and storm and whatever it is you may be facing, and if right now you're like, that ain't me, my life's great. Guess what? The storm's coming. The brokenness is coming, the pain's coming, the suffering's coming. I'm sorry, that's what the Bible teaches. It doesn't teach your life's gonna be great. It's not that. But in the midst of the pain and suffering and brokenness and storm and all that, guess what? God is near. God is with you. Jesus is in the boat. Jesus is with you. And it's that where we place our hope. It's that where intimacy with Christ is formed, when we realize, wow, God, you're here with me. You care enough and you love me enough that you would enter into this with me, that you would be present with me in this, to walk through this with me. That's what Jesus does, and that's who Jesus is. Amen? Now check this out. Jesus is with them. They're walking in obedience. They come into the storm. They're freaking out. And look what happens. Although they know Jesus is with them, this is really amazing, actually. Jesus was sleeping in the stern of the boat. And look what it says again in verse 38. They come to Jesus, and it says, and they woke him and said to him, look at this question. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? They come and they ask Jesus, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Their question suggests that they're actually a little bit frustrated with Jesus's apparent lack of concern, right? The storm's going on. Jesus is taking a nap, like so just disconnected from reality and what's happening. They're like, Jesus, do you actually care? Do you care that we're perishing? You're down here taking a nap? We're about to die. What are you doing? And the irony of this is that these same disciples, very shortly after, will go to sleep on Jesus in his hour of terror in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they will remain unmoved by Jesus's plea when Jesus says to them time and time again, watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. So when Jesus faces his greatest storm in the Garden of Gethsemane, which we're gonna get to later in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are sleeping. And Jesus says, wake up. Why are you sleeping? I'm about to go to the cross. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. I'm about to go to the cross. Pray for me. And they sleep. They remain unmoved by Jesus calling them to enter into prayer and to take care of them and to provide for them. Jesus, however, does not remain unmoved by their plea. When they say, Jesus, do you care? We're about to die. Jesus actually is moved to action. Jesus actually has something in store for them. But before we get to that, I want to focus in on this question for just a moment, because I think it truly is one of the most beautiful and profound questions in all of the scriptures, that as the disciples are in that storm and they're walking in obedience to Jesus, they have faith in Jesus, they love Jesus, they're trying to follow Jesus, and yet they still ask this question, do you not care? Do you not care that we are perishing? And I actually love it how the disciples ask this question. Because before we get so quick to judge the disciples, wow, I can't believe they have no faith. Why are they actually asking Jesus this? If we're honest, we are like the disciples, very familiar with this exact same question. We would like to put ourselves above them and be like, wow, yeah, of course God's gonna get me through that. I'm chill, I'm good. But we, like the disciples, often find ourselves in the midst of the storms of life, in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of the trials and the brokenness. Even when we're following Jesus, we're walking in obedience, those storms and the trials come, and we're in deeper waters than we can handle, and we often ask God the same question, God, do you actually care? And to ask that question to Jesus is a very beautiful and healthy thing. It's okay to do that. It's okay to ask God, do you actually care, when you feel like he doesn't? What we've been taught is, no, just trust, just have faith. If you're feeling like God doesn't care, just kind of stiff arm it and just hardball it and just trust and move forward. But they actually expressed what they were actually feeling to God. They felt like he didn't care. And rather than burying that emotion and saying, oh, I'm just going to get through it and it's going to be fine, they said, I'm actually going to ask Jesus what I'm actually feeling. I'm going to ask him, do you actually care? Because in this moment, I don't feel like he actually does. And most of us, when we don't think God cares, or when we're wrestling with God, why am I going through this storm, this trial, this tribulation, this suffering? Most of us, you enter into the storm and you get angry. You're like, God, why are you allowing this? God, I'm angry at you. I'm angry that this isn't working out. I'm angry that I'm having to suffer like this. I'm angry that you're not answering this prayer. I'm angry that you're not fixing this. I'm angry that you're not bringing me through the storm quicker. We get angry at God and we just passively suppress that anger. We just continue to harbor it, and I'm going to keep going to church, and sometimes I'll still pray and read my Bible, but I'm still subconsciously, passively angry at God because he hasn't brought me through this storm yet. I'm angry because I feel like I deserve better. I feel like I'm trying my best to follow God and walk in obedience, and God, you kind of should throw me a bone here and get me through this, and we're angry at you that you haven't brought us through it. But rather than like the disciples, again, coming and saying, God, like, do you actually care? And starting to process through that with God, we just kind of bury it and suppress it. And I think it's so beautiful that the disciples didn't do that. If you were in the boat and one of the disciples, you'd be thinking, what? God, why is this going on? And they actually asked him that. They actually asked the question. And what I want to challenge you and encourage you in is exactly that, to ask that question. To actually wrestle with God in the storm that he's brought you into. To actually go to God and say, God, do you actually care? I don't feel like you do, and I need to tell you that. God's not offended by that. God's not scared by that. God's not shocked by that. And some of you guys need to hear that because you probably grew up in a church culture that said it's not okay to do that. Don't ever question or challenge God. I think that's the most beautiful thing that you can do because it helps you grow in your faith. He'll reveal you. He'll answer that question as we're about to see in a second. How can we grow in our knowledge and understanding of who God is if we can't have a safe space to actually ask those questions? And if we feel something, we can't actually bring that before him. God's not offended or shocked or disappointed in you for asking that question. So the disciples come and they're like, God, do you actually care? And again, this happens in our life. It happens in our life that the storm, the trial, the suffering arises so quickly, it becomes so severe, and it so consumes our hearts and our minds, and it comes between us and our assurance of Jesus that we feel, God, do you actually care in this season? And if you're in a season right now where that's how you're feeling, like God doesn't care, you can bring that before him. You can pour out your heart to him. You can cry out to him like the disciples did. And when you do that, you will find out that Jesus actually does care. Jesus will answer. You will realize Jesus is with you in that storm. But if you never ask that question, you're just gonna keep going on, suppressing that and believing that God actually doesn't care, and you're never gonna get the answer to the question. So I wanna just challenge you, if you are here today and if you're in that season and you feel like God doesn't care, man, bring it before him and ask him that question. And for those of you that right now you're on the smooth waters and everything's great, tuck that away. Tuck that little nugget away because that's gonna come in handy next month or in 2021. We think, man, 2021 is gonna be all great. No, it ain't, y'all. I'm just saying, it ain't gonna be all great. So tuck this little nugget away for the storm. 2021's coming. I hope it is smooth sailing, but I'm just kind of just like, I don't know, you know? So if the storm comes, God, what's going on with 2021? I wanna talk to you about this. What's going on? You can ask him that question. It's such a beautiful thing. And if you ask that question, that's where Jesus meets you. He meets you in the honesty and the vulnerability. And we see that this is what he does now with the disciples. So they come and they ask him this question. And then check out what happens in verse 39. This is so beautiful. It says, and he awoke, because they came and they woke him up. He awoke, and it says, and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Wow, this is probably one of the coolest verses in all of the Bible. This crazy, furious storm that the disciples who were fishermen think they're gonna die. They wake Jesus up, and Jesus, it says with one word, he says, peace, and then he says, be still. And it doesn't say it started to die down. It says instantly that the wind ceased and there was a great calm. This is the same Jesus. This is the same God who spoke into existence the sea, who spoke into existence everything in creation. And now he speaks to his creation again, and it still obeys him. When Jesus in the beginning said, let there be light, there was light. When he said, let there be the sky and the land and the ocean and the sun and the moon and animals and humans who he created in his image. When Jesus spoke things into existence, it happened. And because Jesus is the author of creation, Jesus also has authority over all of creation as the creator. And in one word, he speaks to the storm. He speaks to the very thing he created. He says, be still, and instantly it's calmed. Instantly, the storm is gone. Only God has that type of power in his words. Jesus here is revealing to the disciples something that I don't think they'd fully understood yet. And that was that Jesus is more than just a good man, that he's more than just a man at all. Jesus, in doing this, is revealing to them his authority as the creator. That only the creator God could do this. And the beautiful thing in this story is that we see a beautiful display of both Jesus' humanity and his divinity. We see Jesus' humanity in that after a long day of teaching under the Palestinian sun, he's so tired that he falls asleep in a boat in the midst of a crazy storm. That's the humanity of Jesus. Jesus was fully human, just like me. He was fully human, just like you. After a long day of work, he had to take a nap. He was like, I'm out. And the storm was happening, and he was that tired that he was sleeping through it. That's the humanity of Jesus. And then right after that, Mark intentionally says that he speaks to the storm, and the storm obeys him to show us the divinity of Jesus. That Jesus isn't just any normal human. Jesus is actually God. Because only God can speak to his creation and command his creation and calm a storm in an instance like this. And it's so beautiful to catch the full picture here of the humanity and the divinity of Jesus, because throughout church history, people tend to stress just one or the other. Those who stress the humanity of Jesus tend to be a little bit more on the liberal side. Those who tend to stress the divinity of Jesus tend to be a little bit more fundamental. And what we need is a balance of both. What we need is a Jesus who actually gets tired because he's a human and has to nap in a boat. But we also need the Jesus who is greater than his creation and can speak to it and command it, and it obeys him. So this is the tension that we have to live within. That the God that we serve is fully Jesus and fully God. That he was fully God and fully human, one person with two natures. If you want to throw around a cool word at a dinner party conversation at Christmas, it's called the Hypostatic Union. What that means is that Jesus is 100% fully God and he's 100% fully man. So just like drop that on your kids or your relatives at Christmas. Hypostatic union. They're going to be like, sick, what's that? And you're going to be like, Jesus is 100% God and he's 100% man. How does that work? I don't know. And I'm glad, because if I fully understood it, I would be equal with God. And so I'm glad that I can't wrap my tiny brain around how that fully works, but it is. So Jesus speaks to the wind. He commands it, he calms it. They're now seeing the divinity of Jesus. They've known him as the human. They've been with him, they've walked with him, they've seen him sleep, they've seen him eat, they've seen him do everything that every other human does, but now they're catching a glimpse of his divinity, and that changes everything. Something clicks for them when they see that. And here's what happens. Check it out, verse 40 through 41, the story closes like this. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And check this out. And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I love this. The disciples questioned Jesus. "Jesus, do you actually care? We're perishing." And Jesus responds with a question for them. He says, "Do you have no faith?" Do you like that? We come at Jesus with a question. He's like, "I got one for you too. I'll play that game with you, right?" So they question Jesus. Jesus drops a question on them. "Have you no faith? Why are you so afraid?" Now, Jesus asked them, "Why are you so afraid?" And what's crazy is Jesus just calmed the storm. the very thing that they were afraid of. And their response after seeing this take place, they're freaked out by the storm. Jesus speaks and calms it. The response of the disciples is not the response that you think they would have. You would think if you were in the boat with Jesus, if I was in the boat with Jesus, you're freaked out by this storm, Jesus speaks and calms it. You would think that the move is to slap Jesus with like a high five and some knuckles or something, right? And be like, you did it, bro. Sick. Or to be like, I knew you could do that. Cool, I'm chilling now, right? Like that's what you would think would be the response. You're freaked out by the storm, Jesus ends it, you're like, sweet, now I can chill, I'm good to go. But the crazy thing is when the storm was stilled, their fear was not alleviated, but rather it intensified. Look at verse 41. It says they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the seas obey him? Their fear was not alleviated, it was intensified. And that's because the only thing more terrifying than being a tiny human on a little boat in the midst of a huge storm, the only thing more terrifying than that is being in the presence of a human who can speak at that storm and silence it. That is more terrifying. And that is what catches them off guard. They're freaked out by the storm, and Jesus goes, peace, be still. The storm's gone, but now they're even more freaked out because they're catching a glimpse of the divinity of Jesus. And this is where we see that the point of the message isn't Jesus calms your storm and everything's gonna be well, because Jesus actually causes a greater storm. You see this? Jesus actually causes more fear to swell up in them. Jesus stilled the natural storm on the sea, but in doing so, he caused a spiritual storm in their hearts and in their minds, because in this moment, they caught something they haven't caught yet up to this point in time. They caught a glimpse of his divinity. They caught a glimpse of his authority. They caught a glimpse of his majesty. They caught a glimpse of who he actually was. Did you notice in verse 36, when they left the crowd, it says they took him in the boat with him just as he was? Why does it make that note? That they took Jesus in the boat just as he was. It's because now they're beginning to discover just who he actually is. They brought him in the boat just as he was, but they didn't fully know who he was. And now Jesus speaks to the storm. He commands it. He has authority. He reveals to them a glimpse of his godness. He reveals to them a glimpse of his divinity. And now they're beginning to understand just who he actually is. And the beauty is, that's the way it works in a relationship with Jesus. When you walk away from the crowd, when you step out of the place of comfort and you step into the boat with Jesus, you receive Jesus just as he is. But guess what? You don't know who he is. I don't know who he is. I just know this is some Jesus guy and everybody's talking about him and he's doing miracles and he's healing and he said he's gonna go to the cross and all this stuff. I don't fully know who he is, but I wanna be in the boat with him. I wanna follow him and try to understand who he is. And you take that step of faith and you step into the boat with Jesus, and guess what? Each step you take with Jesus, you begin to understand more and more who he is. When you step into a relationship with anybody else, you don't automatically fully understand everything about them. The way a relationship with Jesus works is the same as any other relationship. You make a commitment. You say, I want to be in a relationship with you. I want to know you. I want to pursue you. I want to know who you are. I want to know what you've done. And as you walk step by step by step, with your boyfriend, with your girlfriend, with your husband, with your wife, with Jesus, with any person, each step you begin to understand more and more who they actually are. And in this moment, the disciples begin to see who Jesus actually is. That he's more than just some guy. That he's actually God. That he's actually divine. And the beautiful thing about this is that in every single storm and in every single trial that we will go through in life, there is an opportunity and there is an invitation to wonder again with the disciples, to wonder concerning the identity and the authority and the majesty of Jesus. That's what this was for the disciples. The storm came. The trial came, the struggle came. It wasn't, let's just hurry and get out of this. They said, who is this? Who is this Jesus? And when you're in that storm, you're gonna ask that same question. Who is he? Who are you, God? Are you actually good? Are you actually faithful? Are you actually gonna bring me through this? Are you actually gonna be with me here in this? And Jesus revealed to them who he was. And so Mark's invitation for us and Jesus's invitation for us with the disciples is simply this, to ask that question that the disciples asked in the storm, who then is this? That should be a question, not that you just can kind of answer the day that you choose to place your faith in Jesus. That should be a question that we ask every single day. Who then is this? Who is this Jesus who brought us through 2020? Who then is this Jesus who brought me through the cancer? Who then is this Jesus who brought me through the divorce? Who then is this Jesus who brought me through the death? Who brought me through the loss of a job? Who brought me through, fill in the blank, whatever it is. Who is this Jesus? That's what the disciples asked. And when they asked it, they began to discover it. They began to see exactly who he was. And so my challenge, and I think the invitation again for all of us today, wherever you're at on this journey, whether you're in the boat right now with Jesus or whether you're kind of on the shore and kind of watching, kind of a little bit afraid to step out in there, whatever it is, I think the invitation for us is to be able to ask that question again. Who is this Jesus? And if you approach that question with an open heart, if you say, Jesus, I actually want to know who you are, and I'm kind of upset and I'm kind of frustrated and kind of confused why you're allowing all this stuff in my life, but I want to know who you are in the midst of that. And if you do that, Jesus will show you who he truly is. Jesus will reveal his goodness and his heart and his love and his plans. If Jesus already came to this earth and went to the cross for you and for me, if he already laid down his own life to show how much he wants a relationship with us, how much more now when we say, Jesus, I want you. Jesus, I want to know you. Jesus, speak. Jesus, reveal who you are. How much more will he do that? Will he answer that? So my challenge and encouragement that I think Jesus invites us into is today to say, Jesus, I'm going to ask that question. I'm going to ask, Jesus, who are you? And would you reveal yourself to me? And would you speak to me? And would you show me who you truly are? In Jesus' name, let's pray.